I want to start this off by saying, I know this is weird. That's part of the reason I'm writing it down, because writing it down somehow feels more normal than saying it. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. I live in Salem. Yeah, that Salem. The Salem where hundreds of years of history butts heads with tourist traps in this weird, anachronistic kind of way. I think it depends a lot on your perception, whether they blend well together or not. Some people like how kitschy it is, and thinks it makes the history more approachable and interesting, but I don't know about all that. Maybe it's because I'm originally from a bit more superstitious part of the country. Which, I know, is hard to say with all things considered. But it feels disrespectful to me, feels wrong, somehow. Like selling tickets to an execution. I suppose I really can't say all that much, though, since I contribute to it in a way. See, I work in the Salem Witch Museum. Beggars can't be choosers, unless they want to stay beggars. And when I started there, I really needed the money. A history degree isn't really conducive to not starving to death. It's not that bad, though. I get to interact with people all day, and since I lead the tours through the museum, I get to sort of use my degree, I guess. The museum isn't really a museum in the way I would normally imagine a museum. When I think of museums, I think of artifacts behind glass cases and soft lighting with a sort of somber, historic feel to it. I guess we're sort of more like a wax museum. It's set up like a walkthrough with different scenes from the trials recreated using mannequins, in period clothing and historically questionable scenery, all separated by a series of open doors and hallways. Some of the scenes move when we touch a button and lights come on. There's a little narration about the scene and about the events that took place, and I fill in the gaps and answer any questions people have. The whole walkthrough usually takes maybe 30 minutes, and bada bing, bada boom, we're back in the gift shop, so people can buy mortars and pestles and tarot cards and bushels of sage to burn around their house and stuff. It was a pretty normal day to start out with. It's been nice and cool here, without turning cold yet, so we had the doors open all day for people to wander in from outside. The sky was dark and threatened to rain all day, but it kept holding off. Around lunch, I got a sandwich from Red's around the corner and sat outside to enjoy the day until I had to go back. I always hated dark days at home, but Salem just feels like the place for it. With the brick buildings and the autumn leaves, just cool enough to warrant wearing pants and flannel. It's really great. It just feels like the way October should be, you know? When I got back from my break, though, my coworker, Anna, was freaking out, and that's where this all started. "My sister just went into labor," she said as soon as I walked behind the counter. "That's great," I said. No. She just called me, and she's going into labor now," she said. "Yeah, that's great," I said, not quite getting what she was actually trying to tell me. "No, Craig. She wasn't due for another 2 weeks. Jack isn't back from his conference down in Florida yet, and Mom and Dad are picking up my brother from Maine. I really need to go to the hospital," she said, picking the orange fingernail polish off of one of her nails nervously. "Oh," I said, finally getting it. "Yeah, go on, I'll be fine here." "Thanks," she said, hugging me and grabbing her purse before practically sprinting out the open door into the dark, brick street. "Call me if you need anything," I shouted after her, but she was already gone. So, after that, I settled into a long day of manning the counter, selling those kitschy little knickknacks I mentioned earlier to tourists, and a few women who took the whole witch stuff way too seriously. I shut the tours down and told everyone that, unfortunately, due to an emergency with one of our staff, we had to close the tours for the day, but I offered them vouchers for the next day, which shut most of them up. The only one it didn't quite appease was some old crone with white hair and an extremely ornate lace shawl that spit on the ground when I told her I couldn't do tours. She then tore up the voucher I gave her and threw it back at me before stomping off, her black heels clacking on the brick street as she stomped away. At 5:30, the dark clouds overhead finally opened up and let loose a steady, pulsing rain that drove everyone inside, apart from a few dedicated tourists with raincoats and people who had important shit to do. No one carries an umbrella if they were smart. The wind makes sure of that. I closed the doors and settled in for the last hour. At 6:30, I flipped the sign over to the closed side and started the fun task of cleaning up. The bundles of sage and incense give the shop a sort of sickly sweet smell that I try my best to counteract by cleaning everything I can with bleach. It never really seems to work, though. I dusted the more expensive stuff that nobody ever looked at and vacuumed the purple carpet. The last thing on the cleaning list was the basement, where the actual museum part was and where the tours took place. Each night we had to go through the entire exhibit and make sure no one was left inside, pick up any trash we found, and just generally make sure it was presentable for the next day. We were also supposed to check all of the exhibits to make sure they were working. So I took the little miniature broom and dustpan down the steps and into the exhibit, along with the big mag light we kept just inside the door. The first exhibit was a long line of fake trees with fake shrubs and undergrowth, with a little path winding through it to a clearing, where 3 girls danced around a little light-up fire. I hit the button and recited the information right alongside the voice, emanating from the hidden speakers. In the spring of 1692, a group of local girls in Salem, Massachusetts, would begin one of the most infamous events in the colony's short history, and an event that is even today remembered as one of the most tragic miscarriages of justice ever perpetuated in the name of, and with the help of, the law. These young women and the events they inspired would go on to contribute not only to the works of Hawthorne, but many famous artists throughout New England. I swept up a Hershey's wrapper that some asshole had just decided to drop on the ground, but apart from that, it seemed to be fairly clean. The speakers played a few sounds of owls hooting and the sound of a crackling fire as a light flickered on and off in the plastic fireplace. The next exhibit featured the same 3 girls gathered around the shriveled old black mannequin that represented the slave woman Tituba, who sat in a rocking chair holding a large black book in what was supposed to be a 17th century kitchen. The girls all wore smiling faces and were positioned as if they were all trying to read the book over Tituba's shoulder, while Tituba herself wore a motherly smile. I reached under the countertop and pressed the button to let the exhibit play. The girls would often find themselves entertained by the old slave woman Tituba, who would regale them with the tales of Haitian practice of voodoo, often incorporating practices such as suspending an egg white in water and asking the girls. As I was reciting it and sweeping up a balled-up napkin, the speakers erupted with an ear-splitting static that nearly caused me to fall over in an attempt to pull away from the source of the noise. It only lasted a few seconds, but it was so loud, and I had been so close to one of the speakers that I had to lay down for a moment on the ground and let the dizziness clear and the ringing die down to a manageable level. I made a mental note to call Tom, the owner, and tell him the speakers were breaking. Again, when I noticed the mannequins. While Tituba was still staring at the book in her hands with that motherly smile on her face, The three girls were now all facing me, their mouths drawn down into frowns and their lifeless eyes somehow holding an intensity no mannequin should be able to express. I sucked in my breath so rapidly I thought I might choke on it. They didn't move or anything, though I watched them for what felt like hours. They never moved. And when I moved, they didn't follow me. I backed out of the exhibit as slowly as I could and into the one with the fire. I was hesitant to turn my back on the door containing the exhibit with Tituba, but I was also scared that if these had moved, maybe the others had as well. When I finally turned to look, I realized those fears were justified. The three mannequins representing the girls, who had been positioned around the fire as if they were dancing, now were in, well, not those positions. Two were positioned beside the fire, with their period dresses hiked up, wrapped up in a lover's embrace and kissing, but still frozen. The third was faced away from the doorway I stood in, her silhouette illuminated by the small little plastic fire that flickered as the light inside it went on and off again and again. Her legs were spread wide, as if she was touching herself while she watched the other two girls. Her head, though, her head was turned to face me. Her entire body was facing away from me, but her head was facing me, like someone had cut it off and just turned it 180 degrees. Her mouth, too, was pulled down into a frown so intense that it looked as if it had been pulled from a cartoon. Once again, though, they never moved. It was like some maniac had slipped in and repositioned them into such a grotesque state. But even if that were the case, he couldn't have changed their faces into different shapes. The faces were static and painted on for the most part. There's something I forgot to mention. The entrance door to the exhibit locks behind us as we come in. It's that way because when the museum was first started, there was a serious problem with people sneaking into the exhibit in between tours, so Tom added it so that if someone went into the exhibit, they had to exit through the official exit door, which was situated right beside the checkout counter. That way, he could tell them off or know who went in, and if something was wrong, make sure they paid for it. I forgot that fact as well, until I was standing there staring at the mannequin with her head turned all the way around. Then, I was so aware of it, I thought it might make me sick. Actually, no, not sick. It wasn't like I was going to throw up. It was worse than that. It wasn't nausea. It was that strange stomach pain that comes with sheer, unbridled dread, like you swallowed a 20-pound stone. I didn't know whether to turn my back on the mannequin in front of me or leave my back turned on the ones behind me. So I quickly backed into the doorway I'd just come from and into the exhibit with Tituba and her little fiends. They, for some reason, hadn't moved. They were still staring at the space I had been in when they had moved originally. I grabbed the heavy mag light and pressed the button, giving a bright fluorescent glow that chased away the soft yellow mood lighting that normally lit the exhibit. It made the frowning faces of the girls seem paler and more menacing, deepening the shadows on their faces and making their already exaggerated frowns look even more grotesque. I took a deep breath and tried to steel myself. I knew I had to keep going. I knew it, but I didn't like it. I considered running, but something told me if I did, they may actually chase me. So I bit the inside of my cheek and tried to continue on as confidently as possible. I left the broom and dustpan where it was, happy to let the mannequins have it. The next exhibit was a hallway with a series of windows that looked in on a courtroom scene that was supposed to depict Tituba confessing and naming other witches while Judge John Hathorne and the men in the community looked on. I say supposed to because, rather than depicting anything of the sort, the windows were filled entirely with the shape of the mannequins that were supposed to depict the men. They were frozen in a state of what looked to be terror, grasping at the bars and reaching out into the hallway for some non-existent help. Their faces twisted into expressions I can hardly describe other than horrifying. I walked down the line, looking at each of them, wondering if maybe whatever was happening wasn't meant for me, but I was just seeing it. As I shined the light on each of their faces, I managed to get a glimpse over one of their shoulders at the courtroom scene behind them. There, the mannequin of John Hathorne hung from a water pipe overhead, swinging gently without any wind. Once again, the figure of Tituba was in her normal position, holding a figure of a small little doll as she tried to buy her life with the names of others. But now, with everything shifted around her, she now looked as if she was offering the tiny doll to the hanging figure of the judge. I pressed the button above one of the windows, but all that erupted from it was the sound of straining rope. So I continued on. When I rounded the corner, the scene that was supposed to feature the hanging of a convicted witch was entirely without light. Even the soft yellow glow normally used to light the exhibits. Being underground, that meant the darkness was utter and complete. And despite all I had seen already, that scared me the most. The complete darkness. And I hesitated on the edge of the light from the courtroom exhibit for longer than I should have. Finally, my racing heart got the best of me and I walked slowly into the darkness. I kept the flashlight pointed at the ground just barely in front of my feet, not daring to move it to look around me, knowing I wouldn't find anything that I had any desire to see. I walked slowly too, afraid to fall and afraid to show weakness to whatever was doing this. The 20 or so feet that contained the exhibit crossed slower than I could have imagined as I shuffled, step by step, keeping my eyes on the faux gravel path that crunched and shifted with every step I took. At the end of the exhibit, I took a step forward and my flashlight fell on a pair of black Puritan shoes, not more than a foot in front of me, that moved up and down like someone tapping out a timeless rhythm, or a child waiting impatiently. I stopped immediately, and started to pull the flashlight up to see what the shoes and socks were attached to, but thought better of it. I instead inched around them, making a sort of crescent moon around the pair of shoes to get behind them, without having to get any closer than absolutely necessary. When I got to the door leading to the next exhibit, I discovered my heart was pounding so rapidly I could feel each beat in a vein in my forehead. I let out the breath I hadn't known I was holding. And the moment I did, the hand holding the flashlight began to shake violently. I tried to take a deep breath, but even that shook. I doubled over to try and brace myself against my shaking knees. 2 more. Just 2 more. Just 2 more. You can do this. It was at this point that I started to laugh almost hysterically. I don't know why. Probably the stress of it all, but I did. I started to laugh while I tried to keep myself from throwing up and crying at the same time. And even the laughter that bubbled out of me shook and vibrated with dread. It was that laughter that somehow gave me the ability to move again. It unfroze me, and after a moment, the shaking stopped, and I managed to stand upright again. Down the short hallway, a sharp turn right led to another exhibit, and soft yellow light crept hesitantly around it. This exhibit was meant to illustrate what happened to the bodies of the Salem witches. It depicted two gravediggers shoveling dirt into the pit that the accused would be put into after their hanging. Since witches weren't allowed Christian burials, the pits were often crowded with more than one body and very shallow, and the bones sticking out of the ground beneath the gravedigger's feet was meant to illustrate just that. This was also one of the only exhibits that actually moved, with the two men crudely animated to make shoveling motions through some animatronics inside of them. When I turned the corner, the animatronic mannequins were already moving, despite the button never having been pressed to activate the exhibit. They were making shoveling motions like they were filling up the pit, except they didn't have their heads. Their heads were severed somewhere below their shirt collars and were lying inside the pit, staring emptily upwards, while the headless bodies continued shoveling in cheap, jerky motions. Behind them was the door to the final exhibit, and I stepped around them as gingerly as I could, trying not to touch the bodies as they swiveled and twisted. The last exhibit is actually a painting of the town of Salem, with many of the famous townspeople standing on a hill above a cemetery filled with the graves of those who died during the trials, and a plaque underneath reciting the aftermath and how all the victims were commemorated in a memorial dedicated in 1992. The painting is meant to end the tour on a good note after so many morbid sights. But the painting had been changed, just like everything else. It showed a grisly scene of the townsfolk slaughtered, almost down to a man, decapitated or maimed, while the preacher hung from a tree. Their faces were depicted as screaming, and many of them didn't have eyes for some reason. At the top of the hill, Tituba stood, staring straight forward out of the painting with a strange smile on her face. It wasn't quite a smirk, but wasn't quite anything else either. I looked at it just long enough to see what it was and finally pushed my way up the stairs and out of the door, back into the gift shop. Outside, the rain still beat down in sheets, whipped by the rain and a peal of thunder occasionally erupted, but now it was entirely dark outside apart from the street lamps. The air was cold and still smelled like bleach from my cleaning, but after the hot, stifled air in the basement, I didn't care. I grabbed my coat and keys and nearly ran out of the door. I went so quickly, I got close to 100 feet down the road before I realized I hadn't locked the door. I ran back, hoping to lock it and just run as far away from the shop as possible. When I got close enough to look inside the shop, I saw one of the mannequins of Tituba standing in front of the glass doorway, wearing that same half smirk she had in the painting and staring directly at me. I stopped short, and as I watched, the mannequin raised her arm and slowly opened and closed her hand a few times, waving at me where I stood in that cold New England rain. I never got the text the next morning. I fully expected it, but I never got it. The only thing I got was from Anna, thanking me so much for being understanding and letting her go. I never got one from the owner, demanding to know why the doors weren't locked. Never anything about why the mannequins were moved, and when I went in for my shift at noon, nothing, and I mean nothing, was different. There was only one tour that night. A full group, almost entirely composed of the people I'd given vouchers to the day before, and when I walked with them down into the exhibits, The mannequins were all where they should be, like nothing had happened. The only time I noticed anything out of the ordinary was in the second exhibit, where the girls were gathered around Tituba. Well, I was explaining something to the tour group, and they were all facing me. I looked over their shoulders and made direct eye contact with the mannequin of Tituba in her chair. Just for a second, her eyes flickered up from the book and met mine. And then I never saw them move again.